In the suffocating embrace of August 1857, the atmosphere in Leon County, Florida, was not merely hot. It was a physical weight, a heavy, damp shroud that clung to the skin long after the sun had dipped below the horizon. The humidity rose from the swamps and the red clay earth, wrapping the sprawling Oakwood Haven plantation in a stifling grip that made even the act of breathing a labor. The night offered no true respite, only a shift from the blinding, white-hot glare of day to a thick, impenetrable darkness, broken intermittently by the pale, watchful eye of a waxing moon that hung over the fields like a lantern in a tomb. Inside the rough-hewn timber walls of the slave quarters, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of wood smoke, dry earth, lye soap, and the weary, rhythmic breathing of bodies broken by the day's toil. Here, amidst the collective exhaustion of a people stripped of their hours, a disturbing, almost electrical current began to etch itself into the fabric of the night. Eliza, a girl of perhaps 12 years, though her eyes held the ancient, hollowed weariness of a soul that had traversed lifetimes of sorrow, would sleep on her pallet of corn husks in the corner of the cabin. But her rest was brittle, a thin veneer over a deep, turbulent ocean. Night after night, at an hour when the plantation was steeped in its deepest, most unnerving silence, when even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath, an invisible force seemed to seize her. It was not the gradual stirring of a child waking from a dream, nor the groggy disorientation of one disturbed by the bark of a hound. It was a violent, singular motion, a sudden, convulsive spasm that arched her spine and snapped her eyelids open in a fraction of a second, as if a master puppeteer had yanked an invisible thread attached to her very soul. There was no gasp, no cry of alarm to shatter the quiet, no creak of the wooden frame beneath her. She simply lay there, frozen, her chest heaving in a silent, frantic rhythm against the rough, sweat-dampened fabric of her shift. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were black pools, reflecting the shadows of the cabin with a terrifying intensity. She did not weep. She did not call out for her mother, Ada, who slept fitfully nearby. Instead, Eliza stared unblinkingly into the void, her gaze fixed on something beyond the wooden slats, beyond the rows of cotton and sugar cane that stretched into the gloom. She appeared to be listening to a frequency no human ear could catch, witnessing a departure no human eye should see, her small body vibrating with the aftershocks of a trauma that was not her own. The true, chilling import of these nocturnal vigils, however, arrived only with the gray, misty light of dawn. As the morning bell clanged its harsh, metallic summons across the yard, jarring the enslaved community from their brief oblivion, news would inevitably drift in from the wider world, carried by the wind or the hushed words of house servants. A rider from Tallahassee might bring word of a wealthy merchant succumbing to the yellow fever that stalked the swampy lowlands, his last breath drawn at the exact hour of the wolf. Or perhaps a grim whisper would circulate about a field hand at a neighboring estate, struck down by a falling timber or a sudden stroke. Whether it was the slow fade of the elderly in their beds or the violent, sudden end of an accident, the timing was never approximate. It was precise, synchronized to the second. The moment Eliza's body had jerked in the darkness corresponded exactly to the moment a heart had stopped beating somewhere in the county. The community, bound together by the shared, unspoken trauma of their condition, began to look at Eliza with a complex mixture of deep pity and superstitious dread. They recognized that the rhythms of life and death were intimate companions in their brutal world, but this connection was visceral, almost intrusive. It was as if the very breath of death, sweeping across the humid Florida landscape to claim a soul, had to pass through this girl's lungs before it could complete its task, leaving behind a cold, invisible shadow. Yet, in a society where signs and omens were viewed with suspicion by the overseers, and where drawing attention to oneself could invite the lash or the auction block, this phenomenon remained a guarded secret. It was a dark truth, acknowledged only in the terrified, sidelong glances exchanged over the hoe and the plow, a silent understanding that the girl was a living, breathing barometer for the reaper's harvest, waking to the sound of a bell that only she could hear. This narrative, my friends, extends far beyond a mere curiosity in the annals of the unexplained or a fleeting ghost story meant to chill the blood. It is, rather, a somber descent into the very marrow of human destiny, a place where the ethereal intertwines with the brutal, grinding machinery of chattel slavery in 19th century America. As we embark on this excavation of the past, we ask that you aid our work in preserving these fragile memories. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and lend your voice to the discussion in the comments below. It is only through such collective vigilance, through this shared digital vigil, that we can pull these forgotten names from beneath the heavy, settling dust of centuries. The Chronicle of Eliza, or Ilara, as we have definitively identified her through the faded ink of recovered estate inventories and fragmented plantation ledgers, stands as a testament not merely to abilities that defy scientific explanation, but to the unseen hemorrhaging of the spirit. It is a story of the quiet despair and the formidable, iron-willed resilience required to survive a system designed to break the human will. To bring Ilara's world into focus, we have sifted through the physical debris of history in the archives of Tallahassee. We have held letters so brittle they threatened to disintegrate into powder at the slightest touch, smelling of old cedar, decomposing cellulose, and the stale air of forgotten vaults. We have scanned the dense, apathy-filled columns of local gazettes and the cold, bureaucratic probate records of Leon County, searching for the faintest pulse of her life amidst lists of livestock and crop yields. These documents, stained by time and the humidity of the Florida Panhandle, speak in a language of property and loss. We have endeavored to catch the whispers trapped between the lines, to feel the humid oppression that hung over the Oakwood Haven plantation like a shroud. This is not a tale of magic, but an examination of the crushing psychological burden carried by a young girl who felt the tremor of death before the reaper's scythe even cut the air. Her life forces us to consider a profound possibility, that these anomalies, these nightly vigils of terror, where her eyes would snap open in the pitch blackness, were perhaps the only way a fractured soul could scream through the suffocating veil of injustice and erasure. It is a story of a mind tuned to a frequency of sorrow so high only she could hear it, vibrating against the backdrop of the cicada's drone and the overseer's whip. As we piece together the fragments of Ilara's existence, we invite you to look beyond the supernatural and see the human child trembling in the dark, bearing the weight of a town's mortality on her small, weary shoulders. The year was 1845, and the night hung heavy over the Oakwood Haven plantation in Leon County, Florida. It was a darkness that felt physical, a stifling blanket woven from the humidity of the swamps and the profound silence of the slave quarters. The air inside the small, dilapidated cabin where Ada lay was thick, a suffocating mixture of wood smoke, damp earth, and the sharp, metallic scent of blood and sweat. The room was illuminated only by the dying sputtering of a single tallow dip, its flame dancing nervously in the stagnant air, casting long, distorted shadows against the rough-hewn cypress logs of the walls. These walls, chinked with mud and Spanish moss, had witnessed 100 births and 1,000 deaths, absorbing the grief of generations into their grain. On a mattress stuffed with corn shucks and covered in coarse linen, Ada writhed in the final throes of labor. She was a woman carved from resilience, her body hardened by years of picking cotton under the merciless Florida sun. But tonight, she was reduced to raw, trembling exhaustion. Hovering over her was old Esther, the plantation midwife. Esther's face was a map of deep fissures, etched by 70 years of survival in a world that offered none. Her hands, though gnarled like the roots of the ancient live oaks that lined the drive, moved with a steady, practiced grace. She had ushered countless souls into bondage, her touch a blend of necessary roughness and hidden compassion. But as the wind outside began to moan, through the pines, rattling the loose shingles of the roof, Esther felt a prickle of unease that she could not name. When the moment finally came, just as the first gray bruised the eastern horizon, the child slipped into the world. Esther, her hand slick and ready, braced herself for the sharp, piercing wail, the universal protest of a newborn lungs filling with air for the first time. It was the sound that signaled life. But the cry never came. Instead, the cabin was filled with a sound that froze the blood in Esther's veins. The infant, a girl small and fragile, released a short, sharp, guttural moan. It was not the high-pitched mewl of a baby. It was a low, resonant vibration, a sound of profound weariness that belonged to the chest of a dying elder, not a neonate. And then, as abruptly as it had come, the sound vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute, it seemed to suck the air from the room. Esther wiped the child with a rough cloth, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down, expecting to see the blue tinge of suffocation, but the girl was breathing. It was her eyes that stopped the old midwife's breath. They were open, wide and unblinking, pitch-black pools that seemed to swallow the dim candlelight. They did not search for the mother. They did not seek comfort. Instead, the infant's gaze was fixed intently on the far corner of the room, staring through the wooden slats, as if watching a tragedy unfold miles away in the darkness. As Esther pulled the child closer to wrap her in swaddling clothes, she recoiled. The baby's skin was not warm with the heat of the womb. It was cold, clammy and slick with a strange, thin sweat that felt like morning dew on a tombstone. A violent shiver racked Esther's frame. In the quarters, where folklore and faith were the only shields against the lash, signs were taken seriously. A baby born with a caul was a seer. A baby born feet first was a wanderer. But this? A child born with the groan of the dying and the chill of the grave? Esther pressed the infant, whom Ada would name Alara, against her chest, muttering a feverish prayer to ward off the spirits. She knew, with a certainty that settled in her bones, like rheumatism, that this was an ordinary birth. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, reaching for the child, and Esther realized with a sinking dread that Ilara had not just been born into the chains of slavery. She had been born carrying a burden far heavier, a darkness that was already looking back at them from those bottomless, knowing eyes. By the time Ilara turned 4, the unsettling singularity of her birth had calcified into a grim, nocturnal ritual. The slave quarters of Oakwood Haven were places of fitful rest, where the air hung heavy with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and the sour sweat of exhausted bodies. In this crowded darkness, where privacy was a luxury denied by the very architecture of bondage, Ilara's condition could not remain hidden. While other children slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the innocent, Ilara's nights were punctuated by a terrifying rhythm. It was never a gradual waking. One moment she would be still. The next, her small frame would jerk violently against the rough tick of her corn husk mattress, as if an invisible wire had been pulled taut within her spine. There was no sound, no cry for her mother, no whimper of a nightmare. There was only the sudden, wide-eyed stare into the pitch-black void of the cabin's ceiling. Her pupils, dilated to the point of eclipsing the iris, seemed to track movement in the shadows, locking onto unseen specters that drifted through the stagnant air. Old Esther, the midwife whose bones ached with the dampness of the Florida swamps, often lay awake on her pallet nearby. She watched the child with a mixture of grandmotherly concern and ancient, superstitious dread. Esther noted the physical toll, the way Alara's small chest heaved, gasping for air as though she had been held underwater, and the cold, clammy sheen of perspiration that coated her skin even on the coolest nights. It was Esther who first silently charted the correlation, a grim mental ledger that tallied Alara's wakefulness against the plantation's losses. The pattern became undeniable during the fever season. One particularly stifling night, the air thick with the drone of mosquitoes, Alara bolted upright, her hands clutching at her throat. She sat rigid for an hour, trembling, her gaze fixed on the wall shared with the neighboring cabin. As the first gray streaks of dawn bled through the chinking of the logs, a guttural wail shattered the morning silence. It was Sarah, a field hand, discovering her son Thomas, a boy of 5 who had been playing in the dirt just the day before, cold and stiff, taken by a swift, merciless fever. The realization rippled through the quarters with the speed of a brush fire. The whispers were no longer contained. Field hands, wiping grit from their brows, would cast furtive glances at the small girl sitting alone on the stoop. They spoke of tokens and haints, of a child born with a veil that had not been properly lifted. Ada, Alara's mother, found herself standing at the center of this growing storm. She fiercely shielded her daughter, pulling Alara's face into her apron when the staring became too intense. But in the privacy of their shared silence, Ada's own heart hammered with terror. She would look into her daughter's eyes that held a depth of sorrow far too ancient for a child, and feel a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She loved the girl with a ferocious, protective instinct, yet she could not ignore the sensation that she was holding something other, something that vibrated with the frequency of the grave. The other children, sensing the unease of their parents, stopped inviting Alara to their games. She was left to trace patterns in the red clay dust alone, surrounded by an invisible perimeter of fear. The isolation was absolute. At 4 years old, Alara had become a pariah, a silent vessel for the community's anxieties, bearing witness to the departures of souls who passed her in the night, leaving her shivering in their cold wake. By the time 1852 settled over the humid expanse of Leon County, the peculiar affliction of the girl Alara, now 7 years old, had bled beyond the confines of the slave quarters. It was no longer a superstition traded in hushed Gula dialects. It had become a tangible, unsettling reality that the master of Oakwood Haven could no longer ignore. The turning point arrived on a night heavy with the threat of a storm, when the air pressure was so intense it felt like a physical weight against the skin, pressing down on the canopy of live oaks. In the early hours, a curing barn packed with dry tobacco ignited, the flames roaring like a living beast against the obsidian sky. The fire claimed the life of Caleb Stone, the plantation's brutal overseer, who was trapped beneath a collapsing beam amidst the acrid, choking smoke. At the precise second, the roof gave way, and Stone's life was extinguished in a scream lost to the roar of the blaze. Alara, sleeping in her mother's cabin a quarter-mile away, sat bolt upright. This time, however, her silent vigil had a witness from the other side of the social divide. Miss Emmeline Thorne, the planter's inquisitive daughter, had slipped out to the quarters, drawn by the commotion and the rumors. She watched, paralyzed behind a slat in the wall, as the sleeping child's body jerked, as if struck by lightning. Ilara's eyes snapped open, voids of absolute darkness reflecting the distant orange glow of the fire, and she stared unblinkingly into the void. Emmeline fled back to the manor, her silk slippers stained with red mud, trembling as she recounted the synchronization of the girl's waking with the overseer's death. Her father, Elias Thorne, was a pragmatist who measured the world in bales of cotton and ledger entries. He initially dismissed the account as feminine hysteria, yet the seed of doubt had been planted deeply. When subsequent deaths, a field hand from snakebite, an elderly cook from a stroke, aligned perfectly with reports of the girl's nocturnal disturbances, Thorne's skepticism curdled into a cold, administrative anxiety. Seeking a rational explanation that would preserve the order and value of his estate, Thorne summoned Dr. Josiah Hawthorne from Tallahassee. Hawthorne was a man of the new century, armed with a stethoscope and a disdain for folklore. He arrived with his leather satchel smelling of antiseptic and tobacco, viewing the assignment as a waste of his medical expertise. For 3 nights, Hawthorne sat in the corner of the cramped, dirt-floored cabin, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, lye soap, and the rhythmic breathing of sleeping bodies. He watched Ilara with the detached gaze of a biologist observing a specimen. The atmosphere was oppressive. The only sounds were the scratching of crickets and the occasional shift of straw in a mattress. On the 4th night, the silence was shattered, not by sound, but by motion. Hawthorne watched as Ilara's breathing, previously shallow and even, suddenly stopped. Her back arched off the pallet, her muscles seizing in a rigid spasm. There was no transition from sleep to wakefulness. One moment she was dormant, the next she was staring directly at the doctor. Her pupils dilated so wide they swallowed the iris. Hawthorne, shaken, checked his pocket watch. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. He reached for her wrist, finding her pulse thundering like a trapped bird, her skin clammy and cold despite the Florida heat. She did not speak. She only trembled, her gaze fixed on something invisible over his shoulder. The scientific explanation Hawthorne had prepared died on his lips the following afternoon. A rider arrived from town with a black-bordered letter for the Thorne family. The wife of the local sheriff had passed away suddenly from dropsy. The time of death was recorded by the attending physician as shortly after 3 in the morning. Hawthorne retreated to the guest quarters, his hands shaking as he opened his journal. The ink flowed unevenly as he documented the impossibility he had witnessed. He wrote of anomalous vital signs and a profound, unprovoked awakening. But between the clinical terms lay a subtext of dread. The doctor realized that he was not documenting a disease, but a connection to the infinite that defied the laws of physiology. Ilara was no longer just a slave girl to him. She was a human barometer for mortality, a terrifying anomaly that turned his rational world to ash. By the autumn of 1854, the atmosphere inside the small, drafty cabin on the edge of the Oakwood Haven slave quarters had shifted from one of familial intimacy to the sterile tension of an operating theater. Ilara, merely 9 years old, had ceased to be a child in the eyes of those who watched her. She was a biological curiosity, a specimen to be catalogued by Dr. Josiah Hawthorne. The air in her sleeping quarters, once smelling only of wood smoke and lye soap, now frequently carried the alien, metallic scent of the doctor's instruments and the stale tobacco of his coat. He would sit in the corner on a 3-legged stool, a silent sentinel in the dark, waiting for the phenomenon to manifest, his presence a constant, suffocating intrusion into the few hours of rest allowed to the enslaved. The turning point, a fracture in time that would define Ilara's existence, arrived on a night in late September. A hurricane was churning inland from the Gulf, battering the cypress shingles of the slave row with torrential fury. The wind howled through the cracks in the rough-hewn pine logs, extinguishing the tallow candles and plunging the room into an abyssal darkness. Rain lashed against the earth, turning the packed dirt floors into slick mud, while thunder rattled the cast-iron pots hanging by the hearth. It was a cacophony of nature's violence, yet it was not the storm that woke Dr. Hawthorne from his dozing vigil. Usually, Ilara's transition from sleep to wakefulness was a silent, eerie snap, a puppet string pulled tight in a vacuum. But this night was different. As a thunderclap shook the very foundations of Oakwood Haven, a sound more terrifying than the storm erupted from the girl's throat. It was a guttural, tearing scream, raw with a pain that seemed too vast for her small, malnourished frame. She did not merely sit up. She thrashed, her limbs seizing in violent convulsions that knocked over the water basin, sending tin clattering across the floor. Tears, hot and unbidden, streamed down cheeks that had remained dry through years of silent vigils. This was not the passive reception of a signal. It was an amputation of the soul. She trembled as if consumed by malaria, her scream dissolving into a low, rhythmic moaning that persisted until the gray, washed-out light of dawn crept over the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind broken branches and a heavy, humid silence that pressed against the ears. Then came the knock, not the doctor, but a field hand, with eyes wide in sorrow, his hat clutched to his chest. Ada, Ilara's mother, the only anchor the girl had in a world of drifting terrors, had not woken. She lay cold in the adjacent partition, claimed by a sudden failure of the heart, while the storm raged outside. She had died in her sleep, slipping away at the exact moment Ilara had begun to scream. Dr. Hawthorne, who had braved the tempest to document the episode, found his scientific detachment crumbling. He scribbled furiously in his leather-bound ledger, his handwriting jagged from the adrenaline and the dampness of the page. He noted a profound catatonic state and feverish delirium that gripped the child in the wake of the news. He described her expression not as a child mourning, but as a mask of unspeakable grief and self-condemnation. To the doctor, it was a correlation of data points, a tragic coincidence. To Ilira, staring blankly at the rough timber of the ceiling, it was a verdict. The connection she shared with the void had turned inward. It had not just announced death. It felt as though it had invited it. The love she bore for her mother had become the conduit for the Reaper. This event severed the last thread connecting her to humanity. She retreated behind a wall of stone, her eyes holding a bitterness that aged her decades in a single season. She understood now that her gift exacted a price, and to love was to place a target upon the beloved. From that day forward, Ilara became a living shadow, shielding her heart to save what little remained of her world, isolated by a curse she could neither explain nor control. The year 1854 marked a descent into a deeper, more jagged darkness for 9-year-old Ilara. With the protective warmth of her mother, Ada, buried beneath the wet clay of the slave cemetery, the buffer between the girl and her affliction dissolved. The nightly awakenings, once merely abrupt, mutated into a visceral, physical torture that defied medical explanation. It was no longer a silent opening of the eyes. It was a violent seizure of the senses. In the oppressive humidity of the Florida nights, where the air hung thick with the scent of rotting vegetation and swamp mud, Ilara would begin to thrash against her cornhusk mattress, her thin cotton shift, drenched in a cold, unnatural sweat, clung to her trembling frame like a second skin. She did not scream. She had learned the danger of noise, but a low, guttural moan would tear from her throat, a sound so filled with ancient anguish that it made the hair stand up on the arms of anyone unfortunate enough to be near. The phenomenon had evolved beyond mere timing. Ilara began to perceive the architecture of the coming demise. She saw fleeting, charcoal gray shadows darting in the periphery of her vision, lingering in the corners of the cabin where the candlelight could not reach. She heard phantom sounds, the crack of a branch, the splash of water, the hiss of a burning ember, echoing through the rough-hewn timber walls long before the events occurred in reality. The enslaved community of Oakwood Haven, deeply rooted in spiritual survival, recoiled from her. Elders like Esther, who had once looked upon the child with pity, now averted their gaze, making protective signs with gnarled fingers whenever Alara passed. The other children, sensing the palpable aura of dread that clung to her like dust, fled at her approach, leaving her standing alone in the brutal midday sun, an island of silence in a bustling plantation. She was becoming a pariah, a living ghost haunting the very people she lived among. Dr. Josiah Hawthorne, however, drew closer. His initial skepticism had eroded into a grim, obsessive fascination that bordered on the macabre. He spent nights sitting in a cane chair in the corner of her quarters, his notebook resting on his knee, the smell of his pipe tobacco mingling with the earthen dampness of the floor. He recorded the terrifying specificity that now accompanied her episodes. On a Tuesday in late autumn, as a cold wind rattled the cypress shingles, Alara awoke trembling, her eyes fixed on nothing, and whispered a single, ragged word. Water. Her bony finger pointed rigidly toward the north, where the Ashlockonee River bent sharply near the county line. Hawthorne noted the time, 3:14 a.m. 2 days later, news arrived that a drunken ferryman had capsized and drowned at that exact bend, at that exact hour. Another night, she clawed at her throat, gasping for air, as if choked by smoke, whispering, "Fire," moments before a lantern overturned in a stable 3 miles away, claiming the life of a prized stallion and the groom sleeping nearby. Hawthorne's journals from this period became less clinical and more frantic, his handwriting jagged as he documented these correlations. He realized with a growing, icy dread that she was no longer just a passive receiver of death's signal. She was witnessing the method of extraction. The psychological toll on the child was catastrophic. Alara, burdened by the violent knowledge of things she could not prevent, retreated into a fortress of silence. She spoke rarely, her voice rusting from disuse, her eyes permanently wide and filled with a sorrow too deep for one so young. She had become a vessel for the county's mortality, a silent oracle whose every shudder was a prophecy, waiting for the morning sun to confirm the tragedy she had already endured in the dark. By the late summer of 1857, the ledger kept by Dr. Josiah Hawthorne had become a heavy, leather-bound testament to the impossible. The pages, stiff with humidity and smelling faintly of mold, were filled with a meticulous catalog of death that defied all rational medical doctrine. Every entry, a fever in Tallahassee, a carriage accident at Sweetwater Springs, aligned with terrifying precision to the nocturnal convulsions of the girl at Oakwood Haven. Hawthorne, a man of science whose world was built on cause and effect, found himself staring into an abyss that his textbooks could not bridge. The burden of this knowledge became physical, a tightness in his chest that mirrored the stifling Florida heat. He realized he could no longer carry this secret in isolation. When he finally approached Elias Thorne in the dim, mahogany-paneled library of the main house, the air was thick with the scent of cured tobacco and stale anxiety. Thorne listened, his face half hidden in shadow, swirling amber whiskey in a crystal glass. The planter's reaction was not one of skepticism, but of a cold, mercantile calculation. He feared the whispers of witchcraft among his workforce, rumors that could spark unrest or rebellion, far more than he feared the supernatural itself. He agreed to Hawthorne's proposal to bring in outside experts, not to validate the girl's gift, but to sanitize it with the veneer of scientific inquiry. And so, the plantation became a stage for a collision of dogmas. The first to arrive was Dr. Alistair Finch from Charleston, a man whose reputation was built on the treatment of nervous disorders in the wives of the aristocracy. Finch swept into the humid reality of the slave quarters with an air of clinical arrogance, his silk vest tight against his chest, viewing the rough-hewn cabins through the lens of disdain. To him, Ilara was not a conduit for the dead, but a biological machine that had malfunctioned. He spoke in the sterile, detached language of the era, diagnosing melancholic vapors and hysterical paroxysms. In the suffocating heat of Ilara's cabin, where dust motes danced in the shafts of light piercing the warped wooden slats, Finch laid out his instruments on a rough table. The cold glint of silver lancets and the acrid smell of medicinal alcohol filled the small space. He treated the terrified girl as a specimen, prodding her thin limbs with callous fingers, prescribing purgatives and bloodletting to cleanse the phantoms from her veins. He saw only a broken instrument, a case of physiological hysteria, to be cured by draining the vitality from her already frail body. In stark, jarring contrast stood the Reverend Theron Blackwood. A circuit-riding Methodist with eyes that burned with the fervor of the Old Testament, Blackwood descended upon Oakwood Haven like a summer storm. He saw no medical malady in the girl's trembling, but a spiritual battleground. His voice, booming and resonant, seemed to shake the very foundations of the dilapidated cabin. To Blackwood, Ilara was a vessel, either touched by a terrifying divinity or besieged by legion. He organized intense prayer sessions that stretched deep into the sweltering nights, the rhythmic chanting of hymns clashing with the droning of cicadas in the surrounding fields. He would stand over the girl, sweat slicking his brow, his heavy Bible pressed against her forehead like a shield, commanding the shadows to depart. The air in the cabin would grow heavy, charged with the static of his zealotry, as he attempted to exorcise the silence that bound her. Caught between the cold steel of the surgeon's blade and the thunderous judgment of the preacher, Ilara retreated into a silence deeper than the grave. She became a spectator to her own torment, her eyes glossing over as Finch measured her pulse with a gold pocket watch and Blackwood anointed her head with oil. The cabin, once a place of solitary dread, was now a claustrophobic theater of ideological warfare. Thorne watched from the periphery, balancing the potential ruin of his reputation against the terrifying reality that his property possessed a power that neither science nor scripture could contain. Ilara sat motionless on her pallet, a small, dark figure in the center of a storm, sensing the approach of death not just in the town, but in the very air of the room that imprisoned her. By August 1857, the atmosphere in Leon County had curdled into a suffocating miasma of heat and hysteria. The yellow fever, often whispered of as the Bronze John, had breached the boundaries of Tallahassee, turning the bustling legislative town into a necropolis of shuttered windows and lime-dusted streets. In this climate of biological siege, where science seemed impotent against the invisible contagion, the community turned toward the archaic. Reverend Theron Blackwood, fueled by a zealotry that bordered on madness, organized what he termed a service of purification on the grounds of Oakwood Haven. It was a grotesque piece of theater staged beneath the relentless glare of the Florida sun, which beat down upon the assembly until the air shimmered with heat haze. The local elite, including Sheriff Owen Lancaster, gathered not out of piety, but out of a desperate, primal need to assign blame for the pestilence consuming their families. They stood in the dust, wiping sweat from their brows with damp handkerchiefs, the smell of unwashed bodies and horse manure mingling with the cloying scent of blooming magnolias, a perfume that felt obscenely sweet against the backdrop of death. Ilara was dragged from her isolation near the swamps, a small, trembling figure thrust onto a hastily constructed wooden platform. They had dressed her in a coarse white shift, a garment far too large for her starvation-ravaged frame, which hung off her shoulders like a shroud. Her wrists, thin as birch twigs, were bound with rough hemp rope, the fibers biting into her dark skin. She did not struggle. She stood blinking against the harsh light, her large, dark eyes darting across the sea of hostile faces, searching in vain for a flicker of mercy. To the side, beneath the shade of a sprawling live oak, Dr. Josiah Hawthorne stood rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane, his face a mask of suppressed objection. Beside him, Dr. Alastair Finch leaned against a carriage wheel, smoking a cheroot with performative nonchalance, muttering about the barbaric medievalism of the spectacle. But the crowd's eyes were fixed on Blackwood. The Reverend paced the platform, his black coat absorbing the sun's fury, waving a leather-bound Bible like a weapon. He bellowed accusations of dark covenants and shadows in the soul, his voice cracking with exertion as he demanded the girl confess her role in the suffering of the county. The tension was physical, a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. Suddenly, in the middle of Blackwood's thunderous condemnation, Ilara's body went rigid. A convulsion, violent and unnatural, seized her frame. Her head snapped back, and from her throat erupted a sound that was not human, a guttural, tearing wail that seemed to vibrate in the very timber of the platform. It was a scream of pure, distilled agony that silenced the cicadas and froze the blood of every man and woman present. The scream sustained for an impossible duration, then cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. In that precise heartbeat of quiet, the rhythmic thud of hooves broke the spell. A rider, his horse coated in foam and dust, galloped up the main drive, nearly trampling the onlookers. He slid from the saddle, his face a portrait of devastation, and locked eyes with the sheriff. "Sheriff Lancaster!" the man gasped, his voice carrying across the lawn. "Your wife! She is gone! She passed at this very instant!" The collective gaze of the assembly snapped back to the platform. Ilara stood motionless, swaying slightly in the heat. Her eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites, and from the corner of her mouth, a single, dark thread of blood trickled down her chin, staining the white collar of her dress. The prophecy had been delivered, not in words, but in a scream that echoed the exact moment of death. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with a new and terrible understanding. She was no longer a curiosity to be studied, but a living conduit to the grave, a dangerous mystery that looked back at them with the eyes of the dead. The dust kicked up by the sheriff's galloping messenger had barely settled before a suffocating silence descended upon Oakwood Haven, heavier and more oppressive than the humid Florida air itself. Elias Thorne, his face a mask of purpled rage, barely concealing a cold, gnawing terror, watched the stunned crowd disperse. He saw not just neighbors, but creditors and judges, their eyes wide with a superstition that threatened to rot the very foundations of his enterprise. The financial ruin of a plantation branded as cursed was a specter far more terrifying to him than any spirit. With a voice that cracked like a whip, he ordered the grounds cleared, his commands sharp and jagged against the stillness. He decreed that the name Ilara was to be stricken from spoken language, punishable by the lash, effectively trying to legislate a ghost out of existence. Ilara herself, limp as a rag doll and shivering despite the heat, was not returned to the slave quarters. Instead, rough hands dragged her toward the property's northern edge, where the manicured cotton fields bled into the untamed, fetid morass of the cypress swamp. Here stood a structure that was more rot than wood, an old curing shed, its timber gray and slick with moss, half swallowed by the black mud. The air here was thick with the copper tang of stagnant water and the incessant, maddening drone of mosquitoes. Inside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the slivers of light piercing through warped planks like accusatory fingers. She was left on a pallet of damp straw, the door barred from the outside, isolated with nothing but the rhythmic, wet breathing of the swamp for company. An elderly woman, mute and terrified, was assigned to leave food at the threshold. But otherwise, Alara was entombed while still breathing, hidden away like a shameful sin. Meanwhile, in the dim, mahogany-paneled study of the main house, a different kind of burial was taking place. Dr. Hawthorne stood before the hearth, the heat of the fire pressing against his waist, while Thorne paced behind him like a caged tiger. The planter demanded the total erasure of the medical record, his voice low and trembling with menace. Hawthorne, his hands shaking not from age, but from the crushing weight of moral collapse, fed his meticulous notes to the flames, one by one. The parchment curled and blackened, the ink of his observations, pupil dilation, cardiac arrhythmia, prophetic vocalization, bubbling away into gray ash. The smell of burning paper mixed with the stale scent of brandy and cold sweat in the stagnant room. Yet, in a moment of clandestine defiance, while Thorne turned to pour a drink to steady his nerves, Hawthorne slipped a small, leather-bound pocket journal behind a loosened brick in the fireplace mantel. It was a desperate act of preservation, a refusal to let the scientific truth be wholly consumed by the fire of denial. Reverend Blackwood, too, was silenced, his fervor extinguished by Thorne's threat of withdrawing patronage and exposing his failure to cleanse the girl. The plantation fell into a rhythm of terrified normalcy. The field hands worked with heads bowed low, eyes averting the northern swamp edge, afraid that even a glance might invite the shadow that lived there. The wind, rustling through the drying corn stalks, sounded like whispering, carrying warnings no one dared to interpret. Oakwood Haven had become a place of held breath, where the master pretended to rule, but where everyone knew that the true power lay shivering in a shack at the edge of the water, waiting for the next tremor of death to shake the world. Decades passed. Eras shifted like the slow, inexorable turning of the earth, and Alara's story, it seemed, had been meticulously erased from the annals of Leon County. The suffocating weight of time, coupled with deliberate suppression, had buried her existence beneath layers of forgetfulness. Yet, history, in its persistent, often cruel way, possesses a habit of scattering crumbs, minute fragments of truth that lie dormant, awaiting the precise moment of rediscovery. This is precisely what transpired when our team, embarking on an exhaustive yet profoundly compelling quest for truth, journeyed into the hushed, cavernous depths of Florida's historical archives. In the stifling, old paper-scented basement of the Tallahassee Historical Society, where the air itself felt heavy with the dust of forgotten lives and the whispers of centuries, among countless thousands of yellowed, brittle documents, we unearthed a peculiar lot. It was a collection of the personal papers of Dr. Josiah Hawthorne, sold by his distant descendants, who likely never understood the profound, unsettling secrets held within. Most of his records were standard medical reports, penned in a formal, detached hand, detailing common ailments and routine observations. But nestled among these mundane accounts, in one unassuming, old, leather-bound folio that, at first glance, might have been mistaken for a gardener's journal, its cover worn smooth by the friction of untold years, its edges softened by time, we discovered the very heart of what we sought. The pages within were not merely yellowed, they were brittle and amber-hued, fragile to the touch, and the ink had faded in many places to ghost-like whispers, barely visible against the aged parchment. Yet, the precise, almost frantic script was unmistakably Hawthorne's. This was his secret journal, a testament to a mind grappling with the inexplicable, filled with meticulously encrypted dates and astronomical observations that hinted at a desperate search for patterns beyond human comprehension. More chillingly, it contained precise, harrowing descriptions of Alara's nocturnal awakenings. He did not merely record, he documented, with a scientist's rigor and a man's growing terror, her every physical reaction. The sudden, convulsive jolt, the rapid, shallow breaths, the cold sweat that slicked her brow, the dilated pupils that stared into an unseen abyss. He painstakingly attempted to decipher her enigmatic words and the subtle, often terrifying gestures she made in her trance-like state, offering small, hurried sketches of her face, contorted in a silent, primal horror. Interspersed within these chilling records were fragments of letters, addressed, but evidently never dispatched, to other prominent scientists and medical men of his era. In these unsent pleas, Hawthorne's desperation was palpable. He grappled with the limitations of 19th century science, desperately trying to construct a rational explanation for a phenomenon that defied all logic. His final entries, penned with a hand that seemed to tremble even on the page, spoke not only of the deepening mystery, but of a growing sense of profound despair and an almost unbearable burden of guilt concerning the young girl's fate. This journal, this fragile relic of a bygone era, became for us a window into the grim reality that Mr. Thorne had so assiduously sought to conceal, a reality of human suffering and inexplicable phenomena. It was the first slender thread pulling Alara's forgotten story from the oppressive darkness of oblivion, allowing her voice, albeit through Hawthorne's observations, to finally be heard across the centuries. If you value such painstaking investigations into the obscured corners of history, do not forget to like this video and subscribe, for we are only just beginning to unravel this intricate web of secrets. With every page turned in Dr. Hawthorne's concealed journal, the ink grew fainter, as if the very record of Alara's existence was fighting against the erosion of time. The leather binding of the small volume was cracked and brittle, smelling faintly of cedar and the stale tobacco of a century past, preserving the frantic scrawls of a man whose scientific worldview had been shattered. We trace the doctor's descent into a melancholic obsession, his handwriting becoming jagged, almost frantic, the loops of his letters stretching like wire pulled too tight. Then we reach the final entry, dated in the humid spring of 1860. It was not a clinical medical report, nor a detached observation. It was a resignation scrawled with a quill pressed hard enough to tear the parchment. "The silence is deeper than any scream," he wrote. The ink pooled dark at the end of the sentence. "She's gone. But the echo, it lingers." After this singular, haunting date, the bureaucratic machinery of Leon County falls completely silent regarding the girl. There is no bill of sale in the courthouse archives, no certificate of death in the parish records, no notation of transfer to the deep cotton South. In the cold, indifferent ledger of history, she simply evaporated into the humid Florida haze, erased by a system that viewed her as property rather than a human soul. Driven by this unsettling void, our production team traveled to the precise coordinates where the Oakwood Haven plantation once imposed its will upon the land. Today, the site is a skeleton of its former self, reclaimed by the relentless, suffocating encroachment of nature. The grand house is long gone, consumed by fire or rot, leaving only the skeletal remains of brick chimneys, rising like tombstones from a tangle of saw palmetto and creeping vines. The air here hangs heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying pine needles, and the cloying sweetness of wild jasmine. The heat was oppressive, a physical weight that pressed against our lungs, the air shimmering above the ground as we made our way through the overgrowth to the perimeter, where the slave quarters once stood. The wooden shacks have long since rotted into the soil, leaving only slight depressions in the earth, hidden beneath layers of dead leaves. It was there, amidst the buzzing of cicadas and the dry rustle of the wind through the gray drapery of Spanish moss, that we found the anomaly. In a landscape aggressive with life, where kudzu swallows trees whole and weeds burst through concrete, there lies a small, irregular patch of earth that remains stubbornly, inexplicably barren. The soil is gray, powdery, and packed hard, refusing the embrace of wiregrass or wildflowers. It looks like a scar on the land that refuses to heal. We stood over it, the midday sun beating down through the canopy. Yet a distinct, unnerving chill radiated from the ground, raising the hair on our arms and settling deep in our bones. The silence in that specific clearing was not peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, as if the land itself was holding its breath. We were not the first to notice this desolation. In the nearby town, on porches sagging under the weight of years, we spoke with elderly residents, descendants of the families who once worked these fields. Their faces, map-lined with age, grew solemn when we described the location. Their voices dropped to a reverent hush, glancing around as if the wind might carry their words back to the ruins. They spoke of the place where the listener sleeps, a patch of ground avoided by hounds and children alike. They told us of nights when the wind dies down, yet a low, rhythmic thrumming rises from the earth, not a sound, but a vibration, like a heart beating in terror. One woman described it as a cold spot that lingers even in the height of August, a place where the birds refuse to sing. This barren patch is the only physical monument Ilara will ever have. It is a testament not to a marked grave, but to a memory that the earth itself refuses to digest. Whether she lies beneath that cold soil or was spirited away to an unknown fate, her legacy remains stamped into the geography of the plantation. It is a grim reminder that while paper burns and buildings crumble, the trauma of the past leaves a resonance that can still be felt, a phantom limb on the body of American history. We are left with the silence Dr. Hawthorne feared, a silence that demands to be heard across the centuries. What do you believe became of the girl who felt the tremor of death before it arrived? Did she find peace, or does she still wait in the dark? Share your insights in the comments below. If this journey into the shadows of history has moved you, please subscribe as we continue to unearth the voices that time tried to silence.